Good morning and welcome to the Destiny PHARMA PLC Annual General Meeting proceedings. Throughout this recorded meeting, attendees will be in listen-only mode. Questions can be submitted at any time via the Q&A tab situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. Simply type in the questions and press send. The company may not be in a position to answer every question it receives during the meeting itself. However, the company can review all questions submitted today and publish responses where appropriate to do so. I'd now like to hand you over to Sir Nigel Rudd, Chairman. Good morning, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to the Annual General Meeting at Destiny PHARMA PLC. I am Sir Nigel Rudd, the Non-Executive Chair of the company, and I will be chairing today's meeting. It is now just after 11 a.m, and as we have our quorum, I declare the meeting open and we can proceed to business. It's pleasing to welcome a shareholder who's in person. We're also joined by shareholders virtually using the Investor Meet Company platform, who are equally welcome at the meeting. Before turning to the formal part of the meeting, I'd like just to mention a few housekeeping points. Please make sure that your mobile phones are off or switched to silent mode. I'd like to remind everybody present that we do not allow photographs to be taken at the meeting to be recorded or transmitted. And now I'd like to introduce to the board. We have Chris Toby, CEO. We have Sean Clayton, CFO. We have Dr. Deborah Barker, the SID, Chairman of the Remuneration Committee and the Nominations Committee. We have Nigel Brooksby attending remotely. We have James Stern, Non-Executive Director and Audit Committee Chairman. Alan Williams, a Non-Executive Director and Remuneration Committee and Nomination Committee member. And Sybil Love, who is also joining virtually. I'll firstly read out a statement to shareholders which has been released via the London Stock Exchange at 11 a.m. today. We will then turn to the formal business of the AGM. Voting of the resolution proposed, after which we will hand over to Chris Toby, CEO, and Deborah Barker, CMO, who will give a short presentation on the company, following which there will be time allocated for Q&A from those in the room, as well as questions raised by shareholders online via the Investors Meet Company platform prior to the meeting, and all those that are raised during the meeting using the Q&A function. So I'll now read the statement. We continue to believe that XF73 nasal has enormous market potential and can make a huge difference in the prevention of surgical site infections and the reduction in the usage of antibiotics. As announced in our full year results, the company and the board have been focused on seeking support to advance the XF73 nasal program through phase 3 clinical trials. While licensing activities continue, given our current cash runway, feedback from potential partners has led us to evaluate a range of strategic options. Our review of these options has continued since the full year results, and we intend to provide an update to the market in the coming weeks. Immediately following the conclusion of the AGM, Chris Toby, Chief Executive Officer and Destiny PHARMA, will make a short corporate presentation that will be followed by the Q&A session. I would now like to start the formal proceedings of the Annual General Meeting. The notice of the Annual General Meeting, together with explanatory notes, was posted to shareholders on the 9th of May 2024. Accordingly, the requisite notice of the meeting has been given. I propose, therefore, that with your consent, the notice of meeting can be taken as read. Can I have your agreement? Thank you. To reflect more accurately the views of the shareholders of the company, and in accordance with the company's articles of association, the voting on the resolutions today will be conducted by way of a poll rather than a show of hands. This is seen as the best governance practice, as it gives all shareholders the opportunity to participate in the decision making of the company and have their votes recorded in proportion to the number of shares they hold. As there are 9 resolutions being put to the vote today, we will conduct a poll on each of the resolutions after the resolutions have been put to the meeting. We will now proceed to vote on the resolutions which are formally proposed for the meeting. The full text of the resolutions is set out in the notice of the Annual General Meeting, a copy of which you will have received. A summary of the resolutions is also on the screen. Resolutions 1 to 7 are being proposed as ordinary resolutions and therefore requires a support of a simple majority of the votes to be passed. Resolutions 8 and 9 are proposed as special resolutions Therefore, each requires 75% of the votes cast to be in favour to be passed. As a reminder, I'll be conducting a poll on the resolutions after all the resolutions have been introduced to the meeting. So we go to resolution number 1, to receive the report and accounts. The resolution proposes to receive the audited accounts of the company for the year ended 31st December 23, together with the director's report and auditor's report on those annual accounts. Resolution number 2, to approve the re-election of Dr. William Love as director. The resolution proposes to approve the re-election of Dr. Love as a director of the company. Resolution 3 is to approve the election of Sir Nigel Rudd as director. The resolution proposes to approve my election as director of the company. Resolution number 4 is to approve the election of Christopher Toby as a director. The resolution proposes to approve the election of Christopher Toby as a director of the company. The resolution number 5 to approve the appointment of Crowe UKP LLP as the company's auditors. This resolution proposes to approve the reappointment of Crowe UK LLP as company's auditors to hold office from the conclusion of the AGM until the conclusion of the next meeting at which accounts are laid before the company. Resolution 6 to fix the auditor's remuneration. The resolution proposes to authorise the audit committee to determine the auditor's remuneration. Resolution number 7 to authorise the allotment of shares. The resolution proposes to authorise the directors pursuant to section 551 of the Companies Act 2006 to allot shares in the company up to certain limits set out in the resolution. Resolution number 8 to authorise the allotment of shares for cash for non-preemptive issues and general purposes. Conditional on passing of resolution number 7, this resolution proposes to authorise the directors to allot shares for cash without first offering them to existing shareholders in proportion to their existing holdings of shares, i.e. on a non-preemptive basis, up to certain limits set out in the resolution. The resolution granted by this, the authority granted by this resolution can be used by the directors for any purpose. Resolution number 9 is to authorise the allotment of shares for cash for specific uses. Conditional upon the passing of resolution number 7, this resolution, which is in addition to the authority sought by resolution number 8, proposes to authorise the directors to allot shares for cash on a non-preemptive basis up to certain limits set out in the resolution. The authority granted by this resolution can only be used by the directors in connection with the acquisition of certain capital investments. We now move to conducting the poll. I will now conduct the poll on each of the resolutions just put to the meeting. You have 3 options for each resolution. You can vote for the resolution, against the resolution, or you may abstain from voting on the resolution. A vote withheld is not a vote in law and will not be counted in the calculation of proportion of votes for or against the resolution. The results of the poll, including the proxy votes already received in respect of each resolution, will be announced through the Regulatory Information Service and posted on the company's website as soon as possible. Now that the formal presentation of the AGM has been concluded, I'd like to hand over to Chris Toby, CEO, and Deborah Barker, CMO, who will give a short presentation on the company.
Thanks very much, Sir Nigel. Good morning, everybody. Good morning in the room. I'd like, with Deborah's help, to just talk through where we've got to since the last results presentation. And I'd like to give a little bit of an update on some of the new information that we've added to our commercial presentation when we're talking to potential licensing partners. So I think everybody's aware. If you're not, Destiny Pharma is a company with obviously a focus on the development of new medicines in the serious infection space. 2 very exciting assets, relatively late stage, both of them operating in markets with genuine revenue potential. But I think we all know that, and has been well publicised, socialised over the last 20 or 30 years, that there is it's a tough space in which to operate. And I think that many of recent antibiotic launches have been commercially unsuccessful, unfortunately. And what this has driven is a mentality around antibiotics, which is something that any antibiotic company, and there are a number of organizations out there in development at the moment, has to face and has to overcome. And what is going on in the model is that essentially, really over the last 20 or 30 years, much of the development has been for antibiotics that are only marginal improvements on classes of antibiotics that have been produced in the past. Often maybe 5th generation or 6th generation products have been developed. And unfortunately, when those products come to market, there's concern about antimicrobial resistance because the mode of action is not a novel one. And what this leads to is a stewardship in the use of those antibiotics, which often leads to their being metaphorically put on the shelf. And you combine that with very much a health model cost containment situation in most countries in the world. This sort of addition of stewardship and in terms of saving of antibiotics and cost containment leads to the use of older versions, older generations of the same class being used first, and assuming that if they do fail, there's always the shelf to go to. Unfortunately, what this has led to is that when people have introduced new antibiotics in the last 20 or 30 years, they've often struggled to drive commercial revenue in the early days, and that has typically led to commercial failure. And then here's the vicious circle here. Those people that had invested in those antibiotics don't get the returns, and so essentially it's a vicious downward spiral where you get less and less investment in innovation. Less innovation means that products don't break through and get used actively early, and which leads to commercial failure. You can see the vicious circle. Obviously, we feel as though we're the exception. Since the last meeting, since the results, as we said, with the reduced cost phase 3, which Deborah will talk about again briefly a little later on this presentation, and with the greater understanding of the US market potential and how we'd go about, or how a company would go about realizing the revenues in the US. We've been going out and talking to those organizations who are out there who we believe are potential partners. So we've been out there discussing this enhanced proposition. I don't apologize for the content of the length of the content of this slide. This is essentially the executive summary of XF73. And you start really with the first point, which I've made. And the reasons for failure of antibiotics in the last 20 or 30 years is pretty clear, and it's usually linked to lack of innovation. We believe XF73 nasal is the exception to this, and we still believe it has the ability, the potential to deliver strong commercial and investor returns. And a big piece of that is the activity that XF73 has against MRSA. It's the first in class from a proprietary drug platform, so it's novel. And it's targeting indication of prevention of surgical site infection, something which is really key in the battle against antimicrobial resistance. And that surgical site infection treatment modality is well established, and it's established by guidelines, and it's endorsed by key opinion leaders. And we believe that creates a market which will be one that XF73 can enter, and will be one where XF73 is likely to be used much more proactively. So you can see how some of the things already about XF73 are breaking that vicious spiral, that vicious circle that I talked about a few minutes ago. Phase 3 ready topical antimicrobial, excellent safety profile, and as we know, demonstrated excellent activity, that nasal decolonization, pretty much 100% in the phase 2 study. We have a phase 3 program developed. Deborah will mention it in a few minutes. It's de-risked, and we believe that the cost of that program, core cost of the program, is about £25 million, which is, just over a third of what the program was costing before we did this work in the last 3 or 4 months. And we see commercial opportunity of between 0.5 and 1 billion in the US alone. Importantly, the program was awarded FDA QIDP designation, which extends the exclusivity period, the regulatory exclusivity period for XF73 nasal. And, I think many of you will have seen yesterday, we were awarded MHRA ILAP designation, which is great. And sitting in the UK, it's brilliant to get that endorsement from the MHRA on the importance of XF73 nasal. We believe that the commercialization model, and I focus here on the US because that is the largest part of the opportunity for XF73 nasal. We'll be entering a high volume market, and we'll be doing that with a highly targeted and resource efficient approach. So we'll be going after high risk patients, so the sort of patients treated by cardiothoracic surgeons, breast reconstruction surgeons, and some of the most severe orthopedic surgical interventions. And we'll be targeting particularly those patients who have got proven MRSA nasal carriage. Very clear and strong differentiation versus mupirocin, which I'll reinforce in a minute. Not least the fact that we'll be the first medicine with the actual label, the prevention of surgical site infections. Mupirocin doesn't have that. We'll have very clear MRSA activity in the label, and the dosing and the administration schedule means that compliance is likely to be much better. And as we all know, there's a lack of resistance being seen with XF73 nasal, which is very different to many of the other widely available antibiotics today. And we see a clear price path, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It's some of the research that we've done in the last 9 months. And all of that leads to a positive economic argument and a tailwind that we believe will be sort of generated by payers who are, particularly within the US system, heavily incentivized to lower, reduce, maintain at a low level the amount of infections that are happening in hospitals, and particularly post-surgery. Just to give you a sense of the sort of outreach and the scale of the outreach that we've been engaged in, and the story typically starts like this when we're talking to potential partners. We talk about the opportunity, post-surgical infection prevention. It's very clear that infections occur post-surgery, and the approach of nasal decolonization, it's standard clinical practice, and that's really important when you launch a new medicine. Having to do market development is much harder than taking share from a single product, especially when that single product is an older. Be careful with the ageist comments. An older antibiotic, which is being used off-label, mupirocin. And then finally, the final point we make is obviously the one clearly that we will be the only product with an approved license by the FDA in the most important instance for the prevention of surgical site infections through nasal decolonization. So there's a market, there's a standard of care, which is essentially an old product, it's not promoted, and essentially we are coming with a label and a lot of advantages. It's a huge opportunity, however you look at it. These circles essentially are US surgeries, and in the US, about 50 million surgical procedures a year, and we estimate that by peak sales that XF73 can have at least 2 million of those surgical procedures. So nasal decolonization with XF73 could be used in up to 2 million patients by peak. Why are we so confident about that? Well, as I said earlier on, essentially, the competitor we have is upiricin. It's the only other antibiotic which is used topically for nasal decolonization. And, you know, the positive differentiation is really very, very clear. I'm not going to go through the full list, but you can see for yourself how strong the competitive positioning of XF73 nasal is. And importantly, if you go down to the orange boxes, we have patent protection up to 2035. And from a regulatory exclusivity perspective, we have in excess of 10 years regulatory exclusivity in the US, in Europe, and in Japan. Pricing, people always ask us about pricing. And essentially, in all the research that we've done, we've seen quite clearly that there's a lot of support for a strong price. So we believe that the price for XF73 nasal will be somewhere between about $200 and about $500 net in the US. And this could be higher, given that the drug will likely focus on MRSA in the first instance. So we know that when we do our calculations about potential revenue opportunity, that we're going to have a strong price. And then finally, one of the big questions we've asked about, and I've simplified this for the purposes of this session, but one of the things people have asked us about is, okay, so how do we go about making a success? How do we go about commercializing XF73 nasal in the US? And this is a nice summary of that. So in the early days, where do you focus? Well, you'll focus on orthopedic surgeons, you'll focus on cardiothoracic surgeons, and you will look at, you know, breast surgeons in certain centers. You'll be looking at non-emergency procedures, and typically the patient will be having their operation in hospital. It will be a major operation, you know, heart valve, but a major operation. You will be targeting those patients that have got proven nasal carriage of MRSA or Staph aureus. And the administration schedule we know for XF73 will mean that the patient is typically taking 4 of the 5 doses at home, and then the last dose will be given in the hospital after the surgical procedure. In terms of funding, in terms of US reimbursement, it's a complex system, but essentially most of the funding for XF73 will come through payers who are funding community-based products, community-use products, because typically the patient will pick the product up from their retail pharmacy and they will be self-administering, as they currently do with upiricin. And then finally, we priced in our models XF73 at a net price of about $268. So what I'm going to ask Deborah now to do is to just give us a sense of the phase 3 program that we're talking through with potential partners, and maybe highlight a couple of the elements that she talked about when she talked to us so eloquently at the end of in the discussion of the end of year results. So if I hand over to Deborah just to give us some of the high points on the phase 3 program.
Thanks, Chris. Happy to run you through the phase 3 program at a high level. I think one thing that's really important to point out, as Chris mentioned earlier, is that this will be the first drug approved with a label for prevention of post-surgical staphylococcal infection. This program has been agreed at a high level with the FDA to deliver that label. We have agreement with the FDA that 2 placebo-controlled studies in 2 different surgical indications will be adequate to provide then that broad label, which will enable prescribing across multiple surgical indications, not just in the indications where we've run the trial. The indications we've chosen to run the trial are, or the 2 trials, are breast surgery and cardiothoracic surgery. And these are surgical indications where, despite all the best treatments available and best practices and guidelines and everything else, there unfortunately is still a very high risk of the patients having a post-op infection when they're colonized with Staph aureus preoperatively. So the unmet medical need in these indications remain high. From a drug development perspective, that's good because it means that we can run those studies with fewer patients, because you need fewer patients to show a difference between the arms of the studies. And it means that these are also commercially very attractive markets. So these studies will be run in patients who are colonized with Staph aureus, and we're particularly enriching the population of patients colonized with MRSA. Now, MRSA is really high in the US. It's 35% of all patients that are colonized with staph are colonized with MRSA. Much higher in other parts of the world. I think in Asia, it's above 50%. In most countries, 85% in Korea. Slightly lower in the UK, I have to say here, they've done a good job in managing that. But we're enriching for MRSA, and that will be the kind of key differentiator and key kind of entry point to the market. So we will have that specifically in the label. And given the high unmet medical need and given the focus on MRSA in these studies, we think we can run the studies with around 500 patients per trial, which is significantly lower, giving us 1,000 patients in total, which is roughly what we would need anyway to provide a safety database for the FDA. We were looking at 2,500 before, but focusing down on these high-risk patients, we can bring it down to 1,000 patients. So that's very feasible to run in a reasonable time frame, because we want to get this to the patients as quickly as possible. And the clinical cost we have, we've been out to the clinical research organizations that would be doing the operational running of these studies. And the current estimate is around only 25 million in total for the 2 studies for the clinical costs of these trials. So it gives us the first label for a drug in this indication with a reasonable number of patients at a reasonable cost in a reasonable time frame. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Deborah. So in the last, it's just over a month since the results. We've been talking to potential licensing partners with the new proposition. The new proposition, which includes a very different costing around the phase 3, and also a much clearer, I think, and more impactful set of messages around the commercial opportunity. Still in this unfortunate sort of challenging antibiotic space for many people, and we've seen a lot of the big companies exit in the last few years from their own internal development. But as I said, we're currently in the early stages of discussing the enhanced proposition, so it's probably too early at this point to know exactly how well that proposition is going to go down across the board. But we just know that it's a major jump on from where we were before. But given the feedback we've taken from potential licensing partners, we use that to enhance the proposition. But we've also, as we announced at the end of year results, we've also begun to evaluate a range of strategic options to further progress the program. And we've been working with our financial advisors, Rothschild & Co. and Shore Capital, on those options. And as the chairman said in his statement at the start, we, as well as continuing to look for potential licensing partners, we've been reviewing our options, and we intend to provide an update to the market in the coming weeks. So I think it's time to move to questions.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, please do continue to submit your questions just using the quick Q&A tab situated on the right-hand corner of the screen. Just while the team take a few moments to review those questions submitted today, I'd like to remind you the recording of the presentation along with a copy of the slides and the published Q&A can be accessed via your investor dashboard. As you can see, we've received a number of questions both pre-submitted and throughout today's meeting, and thank you for all the attendees for submitting those. Sean, if I may just hand back to you to take any questions in the room, and then where appropriate to do so, just read the questions from the Q&A tab and give your responses, and I'll pick up from you at the end.
Any questions from that? Yeah, on the strategic review, the thing that makes me nervous is I'm going to wake up in a month and found you've done a massively diluting placing or share issue. Can you reassure me on that?
I don't think we called it a strategic review. I think we said it was a review of strategic options. It was for XF73 nasal. And I know the semantics for us are actually obviously quite important. I think we've talked about our cash position. We have cash until Q1 25. That hasn't changed. We are, as I said, laser focus is on trying to license this product, and nothing's changed from that point of view. So I can't really comment on the first part of your question, but just say that we have cash until Q1 25, and we are, we're currently working to see if we can license the product, and we will be coming back in the next few weeks with the, with the conclusions of our review of sort of our strategic options.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Are there any other questions?
Yes. Question, a company called Ondine Biomedical has a phase 2 ready drug, and they've managed to get hospitals to use it in many countries, including the UK. Why can't we do the same with XF73? Thank you for the question. Ondine Biomedical have a device and maybe Deborah, you could answer the what is the product, and then I'll answer the second part of the question about the progress of that program.
So Ondine have a drug device combination or antiseptic device combination where methylene blue is applied to the patient's nostrils, and then it's activated by providing light from a machine at a specific wavelength. And they've been able to get this into hospitals in the US and Canada because it's registered as a medical device, and therefore they've been giving it away so that patients can use it. They've not been able to do that in major markets like the US because it's not registered. Chris, does that?
Yeah, no, thank you, Deborah. And so the reality is that they're not in very many places, and essentially they've given it away where they have some presence in the UK, and they're looking to fund the phase 3 program. So we wish them the best as fellow developers of solutions in the antimicrobial space. But I think one of the clear differences is that obviously XF73 nasal is an antibiotic. And essentially what Ondine are progressing is more of an antiseptic. And as I said, I think clearly articulated, we can see where our opportunity is in surgical site infection prevention, where our target is the replacement of mupirocin. And that's a well-established market, and it's one where physicians and specialists in the space are looking for an antibiotic replacement rather than antiseptic replacement. But thank you for the question. There's a question about non-dilutive funding, and I think the answer to that is yes, we continue to seek non-dilutive funding. We are regularly making submissions for non-dilutive funding. We don't really talk about it much, but we have a pipeline program called XF73 dermal, and we are looking to move that forward this year. We're doing a number of preclinical studies with XF73 dermal to identify more clearly where we will take that drug in clinical development. For instance, would it be diabetic foot ulcers? Would it be serious burns? And for that, we will need non-dilutive funding, and we are in a number of applications for that. So Similarly, alongside the XF73 dermal program, we announced last year that we had activity for the XF platform in fungal infections. And, I think that as well as bacteria causing humans pretty serious problems in the long term, fungal infections are also slated as a real issue for mankind to deal with. So we're excited about the potential for an XF, a new pipeline asset, a new XF pipeline asset in the fungal space, and we are currently doing screens to see where our XF pipeline product of choice, where that actually works in different fungal species. So we look forward to bringing more news about that to the market as well. But yes, we are actively looking multiple sources of non-dilutive funding. Deborah, there's a question in here. How reliable is the CRO estimate of £25 million?
It's pretty reliable, actually, because it's not the 25 million is an average of multiple CRO estimates. So it's not just that we went to one CRO and said, what you think, and they said that. So we have a number of estimates. We looked at it on the cost per patient basis that ranged from slightly below that to slightly above that. So that was an estimate. Obviously, until you go out with the final protocol, it's not a final number, but I would say that's a reasonable estimate because it's not just based on one CRO coming back to us. We went to, I think, the 6 or 7, and that's an aggregate of the different quotes that we got.
Thank you, Deborah. If XF73 has so much potential and meets an unmet need, why has it been so difficult to find partners? Study costs of 25 million are really quite small in industry terms. I think we'd agree. I think that what I tried to lay out today, in full transparency, was first and foremost there is a perception and a dynamic around the development of antibiotics per se. Hence the whole AMR sort of campaign, and unfortunately that has been driven by a lack of innovation, combined with improving stewardship of the use of antibiotics, and part of that stewardship has been holding back antibiotics which are not a new class to try to save them and stop us having to use some of the very special antibiotics that still work in most cases, antibiotics like vancomycin. So there's a challenge with the sort of the disease space with respect to funding, and a number of pharma companies have exited the market, although there are still a number of companies like GSK who are still involved. Alongside that, and we've said this, from the feedback that we have garnered from all of the licensing conversations we have, and I hope you got a sense of the breadth of the outreach that we've gone through from the slide I threw up earlier on. We were told that the phase 3 was too expensive for people to get involved in, and we were told that people didn't understand how the commercial opportunity would be realised. As I said, after the results, we've been in a position with a new proposition to go back to many of those companies, and we're in the early stages of doing that, to talk them through the new phase, the lower cost phase 3 program, which we'd be looking for them to fund or part fund, and to explain to them how they would go about realizing that sort of $500 million to $1 billion US peak sales opportunity, and going further afield into other countries, particularly those countries where MRSA is an issue, because that's where XF73 nasal is likely to excel. Yeah, I think that is I think from what I can see, we've pretty much answered all of the questions. There's multiple questions come in, which are essentially the same question. And so I think that I'd say that the question session, I'm going to draw that to a close. Thank you, Paul.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed.
I think since all the questions that have been answered, etc., that concludes the business of the meeting, and now I declare the meeting closed.
So Nigel, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for updating attendees today. Can I please ask attendees not to close this session? You should be automatically redirected to provide your feedback, and all the management team can better understand your views and expectations. It's only take a few moments to complete, and I know it's greatly valued by the company. On behalf of the board of Destiny Pharma PLC, we'd like to thank you for attending today's annual general meeting proceedings. Good afternoon to you all.
Good.